know about. You better cite the right references, because maybe one of the guys on the panel is, like any other proposal, is somebody you should have cited. It's a little bit like, and again, don't just, I hate these proposals. It's review of prior literature, 2 paragraphs. First sentence has 5 bracketed numbers after it. The next sentence has 10 bracketed numbers after it for all these papers, which mean nothing to a reviewer who's a generalist, and even a reviewer in the area. They're going to go down and look at those numbers and try to figure out which papers and what's in them. No. Try to explain really what prior work has been done in a way that summarizes that convinces people that what you've done is different. Don't waste a lot of time just reviewing the area, but you need to make a case for originality. And if there's some other work that's been done that seems close, you better distinguish what you're doing from it. Because there may be an expert on the panel. But there are a lot of other things you said that I was wishing I could add a few words to, but I think that's the main one.
So in the Biological Science Directorate, the career proposals are reviewed with the regular proposals. There's no separate panel for careers. And so it's an interesting dynamic, because everybody says, okay, this is a career, okay, let's take that into account when we discuss it. In a way, I think it gives a little bit of an advantage to the career proposals, because I think they're given a little bit of a pass to some extent. But one of the things that I wanted to say, when they have, you watch figure skating in the Olympics, the judges, to a large extent, it is subjective. And oftentimes they're very stringent in the beginning, and then they start to lighten up, or it's in gymnastic as the competition continues. Well, to some extent that happens in the dynamic of the panel. And what is really good about the panels I've been on is at the end of the day, before we leave, it used to be that before the electronic age, we had 3 postums on the wall with the PI's name and the proposal number, and then we had the must fund column, the fund if possible column, the okay column, and the needs work, and then the dead on arrival column. And we take the proposals and we post them on the wall, and then where you were in terms of the top of the column was the priority. And at the end of the day, what we would do was we would say, okay, we've heard all these things. Does anyone want to make an argument for positioning some of these proposals? And then we'd take a half an hour and we would go through and after hearing this proposal, after this proposal, we think this proposal is better than that proposal. And you have to make this is not done, willy-nilly, it's done deliberately. And then at the end of the panel, we do it again. Then the program officer has a lot of discretion in terms of making recommendations, and it may well be that you might want to fund a junior faculty member ahead of a senior faculty member that has 2 grants, or is maybe can take a no-cost extension for a year. If you can justify it in your own mind that this is a young person or a PI that probably would benefit from a boost at this point in time. And I think you have to justify that up the chain of command.
It's becoming more evident, I think, here to you, that as you move from one division to another, the rules are going to be different. So this goes back to something that was said very much earlier, which is you've got to talk to the program officers in the area that you're going to go and find out that what we told you is inaccurate for that program. Because between Ross and me, between biological sciences and the sides, the computing, information science, engineering, there is a lot of difference. In my division, for example, we had a set, because of all reviews were based on deadlines. Proposals come in for a deadline, and there's a batch of proposals. We couldn't do what he's saying because the deadline for career proposals is different than the deadline for proposals in our program. So careers were handled completely separately from everything else, and there was pretty much a separate budget allocated within the division for careers. So our career panels were pretty much like other panels in the sense that we had a sense about what percentage of them we could fund at the time of the panel meeting, and so we meaning program officers, could give the panel this guidance as to how much sifting they needed to do. If we knew we could fund maybe, if we had a dozen proposals and we knew they were unlikely to fund more than, say, 3 of them, we would hope that they could have, in the highest category, somewhere between maybe 2 and 4 or 5. You couldn't put 10 there because that panelist would then be abdicating their responsibility to do any sifting through proposals. And as we're also getting to, I think, was after the panel meeting, then there's a meeting, at least in our division, a meeting at the division level of all the program officers who conducted panels to try to decide which ones to fund. We had in our division, we had 3 main programs, not counting the cross-cutting programs. And they each had a separate budget within the division. And the decisions as to what was going to come out of that budget was done by the set of program officers that they called a cluster, responsible for that area. So I was in the Computer and Network Systems, CNS division, but I was within the Computer Systems cluster within that. The computer systems people all would sit down together and start depending on the people involved, in some cases strongly advocating for proposals that they wanted to fund, in other cases just reporting the results back from the panel. Some program officers really would fight to get a bigger share of the funding, so to speak, by talking up proposals that their panel had to try to get a higher percentage of their panel funded than the other ones. And then there would be discussions about that, and all these other issues come up, like, is this the person's last try? How does this compare with other proposals outside the panel? And how does it fit our portfolio? Just like in stock market advising, they tell you to diversify your portfolio. NSF program officers are under directions to diversify their portfolios. So within the area that they're responsible for funding research, they're not supposed to concentrate all their funds in one sub-area. They're supposed to spread it around in a reasonable way. And also spread it around in a reasonable way between, as you were saying, more senior people and people starting out. So this balance issue will also come up. There's a lot of other things that come up in those discussions, but they are all logical things that would not be known to the panel, the bigger picture issues.
And you really don't have control over that as a PI, other than producing the best possible product. But when you say
but that's again where the story comes back. Okay, after that meeting, there's another meeting, which is, in our case at least, with the division director, where the cluster, the lead for the cluster and a few other members of the cluster will be in a conference, the division director, who will say, what are you proposing to fund? And he has to agree, he or she has to agree. In my case, it was a he. And they want to have an elevator pitch for each proposal, on which basis they may have read this project summary, they may have read some of the reviews, but they may not have done their homework too. So you need to give an elevator pitch. And based on an elevator pitch, they'll either agree or they'll start asking more detailed questions like, I'm not sure, why are you wanting to fund this proposal? And this all goes back to your proposal and the panel summary. Everything is summarized at each level. Okay, so the way you present the core of your ideas, if it's easy for someone else to absorb it and quote it or synopsize it in a panel summary, that gives you a better chance at this next level. If it's easy for the program officer to take your pitch and present it in a few sentences to the division director, that increases your chances. So it's really important, I think, when you're writing the proposal to imagine this process and develop your elevator pitch and make sure that it floats to the surface of the proposal as you present it, both in the project summary and in the introduction of the proposal. Now, what is it that's interesting and new about the research and about the teaching? And if possible, what is the impact going to be? And remember, this term broader impacts is not well understood by people outside NSF. I don't think that people actually read the NSF proposal preparation guide. If they did, they would see that it starts out with what is the benefit to society of the research. Not, people get all hung up on outreach and bringing in underrepresented groups, minority groups into their field and integrating teaching. Yeah, those are all broader impacts. But what Congress is interested in when they fund NSF is it going to improve society or is it going to improve the economy? So now some of your fields that may be harder to do, and others there is a big impact and you want to make sure that you talk about it. So if this research is successful, is it going to benefit people, ordinary people who aren't specialists in research in this area? And make sure that you know, a one-sentence statement you can give about that somehow in the proposal. If
Creative use of highlighting throughout the proposal, I kind of like to do that. You know, you don't say blatantly, say, this is the take-home message, but something that stands out in boldface.
Right.
You know, that's the kind of thing that the reviewer will paraphrase and put directly into their reviews, maybe even subconsciously. Just
in the solicitation and also in the proposal and preparation guide, there's a list of the merit review criteria, and then after that it says these will be applied equally to both intellectual merit and broader impacts. That's a checklist that the panelists are supposed to follow, and if they have a good program officer, they're going to hold them to that and make sure that each review addresses each of those issues. So you had better, in your proposal, make it easy for the reviewer to grab a sentence for each of those topics to pull out. You know, what is I don't have the list in front of me, but my favorite one on that list that people forget about is how are you going to assess the degree to which you succeeded in what you set out to do? I think they use the word metrics in there, if I remember right, too. In some objective, measurable way, how are you going to determine what you did, succeeded or failed? And they want that applied also to the broader impact issues. So if you're in the teaching, how are you going to assess that this new course you developed is actually a success in whatever the goal was you stated for that course? If you're doing outreach to a particular community, how do you assess after a few years whether you had an impact in reaching out to that community? If you don't address that, you're going to be viewed as being lacking credibility in the area. So again, make sure that people have, what is the assessment plan, that they can find it in the document for every one of those points.
So I thought I would just stop real quick. We have about 5 minutes for questions. This has gone by so fast.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give people an opportunity, if there's burning questions, to have a chance to.
Professors like to talk.
It's an occupational hazard.
So, if I want to serve in an NSF panel, how do I go about it?
Okay, now, you will not be able to serve on a career panel with high probability. Because, what we said earlier, they usually look for people that are generalists. Although there are a few divisions where you can, so inquire. But generally the answer is contact the program officer, first by email, and maybe follow up by phone if you can get a conversation with them. Tell them give a one-page or a few paragraphs about yourself, what's your research area, that you're interested in getting panel experience. Enough that they can identify the kinds of panels that you would want to.
Yeah, and you've got departments, you have colleagues that have probably been on NSF panels, and they can recommend you to their program officers and so forth.
But a cold email, it should be successful, and if you're not sure which program officer to contact them all, but CC them all so they know. If they don't all feel like they have to respond and they're wasting their time if someone else is going to respond. So CC them, and then if they respond, everybody will see the response.
It's a lot of work, keep in mind, and if you're building your program now, building your teaching, so it's a lot of work.
So how many proposals do we typically review if I'm part of a panel, just on an average?
The panels I did had up to 30, typically 20 to 30 proposals.
Yeah.
And each panel member has to review all the proposals?
No.
Just when, in my directorate, there's a primary and a secondary that submit reviews. Now, the reader oftentimes will read it for content, but not write a review. So there'd be 3 plus a program officer.
Yeah, we didn't have that distinction, but at the time of the panel meeting, there's always one person selected to open the discussion with a summary of what the proposal is.
It's a really interesting process because you don't see the ad hoc reviews or the review of the co-panelists with you until you submit your review. And so you have this trepidation, you press submit, and then you wait to see whether you've nailed it or whether you've really screwed up.
Well, then you get to read the other guy's review, and if you miss some important point,
it's good. No, it is good, but it is, I think we all,
No, that's intentional. It's an option within the fast lane system, but most program officers will make the review process blind so that we don't have the first reviewer skew the outcome.
Sometimes the reviews are blind.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what if, let's say, within one academic year, and so do the materials have to be completely separate, or they can have some small overlap, or
They really should be separate.
separate?
We talked earlier about this larger research program that you have. You should be able to partition it.
Right.
And the career part, since it's a longer duration proposal, should be, I often tend to think of it like a tree. The career proposal will be sort of like the trunk of the tree, and the other proposal will be like the branches. Although maybe it branches closer to the ground, I don't know. But they should be separate lines of research, separate problems, but within the same area. So if you submitted other proposals, they should be consistent with the overall description of your research plan, but not overlap in any way with the specific research you're going to do with the money that you're getting from the proposal. So you can imagine if you had PhD students, the different PhD students would be working on pretty much separable
Do we have
pieces
anybody
of
from
research.
EOAS here? No. So the Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, people that submit to the OCE division, oceanography, they're told that they should get a regular NSF grant first and then go for the current.
I've heard people say that too. Don't delay too long submitting your first career proposal though, because the feedback you get is important. And we're in danger of overgeneralizing from each of our limited experience here, but in my experience, we had so many applications for career proposals that we ended up typically funding most of them in the second or third try. Very few were funded on the first submission. And it was not unlimited funds, but the people who were making the second and third try had much more polished proposals. And they came out higher in the rankings. So number one, don't get discouraged, but don't delay too long because you won't get that feedback that you need to polish it. In the meantime, don't hold back writing other proposals. You should be submitting other proposals. And the feedback you get from the other proposals may also be helpful to you in terms of improving your grant writing.
Yeah, so the dollars don't go that far for a career grant, especially if we get our piece of the action in terms of indirect costs.
So how much preliminary data are you expected to put in the career?
I think this is going to vary a lot across fields. By talking with other program directors and serving on some cross-cutting panels, I know in some fields it's absolutely essential that you have significant preliminary results. And in some areas, it's almost a culture that you sort of do the research, a lot of the research first, and then before you've published it, you submit the proposal, and the preliminary results are the research you've done in advance. I really reacted very negatively to that as a program officer when I saw it happening, because that's not the culture in my area. In my area, to have done the work and then ask for money for work you've already done is fraud. Okay. So I would recommend that number one, that if you do preliminary results, clearly separate in your proposal what you had done previously. Oh, and by the way, what you've done versus what other people have done, is some people forget to separate. Separate clearly what you've done previously from what you're proposing to do to avoid this fraud issue. But it's really good to have enough preliminary results to support the plausibility of your plan. And sometimes you don't actually need to actually do research. Sometimes it's a matter of some back-of-the-envelope calculations, some simple examples you can work out by hand. But you need something to substantiate the approach that you're taking, and the problem has a chance of being solved by the approach you're taking.
I think proof of concept data is really essential for a lot of areas, certainly in the experimental disciplines, in the physical sciences and biology, and even in engineering. And if you don't, then I think what you have to do is you have to have something in your proposal that basically says anticipated pitfalls and how you will deal with the pitfalls in case it does fall through.
Well, that's always good anyway. On a 5-year proposal, you should have a very clear plan for the first 2-3 years. But beyond that, you need some contingency planning based on how the things work out in the first few years.
Okay,
I hope
we'll
you're
have to cut you two off. So we're going to start, it looks like we're still missing a few people, so we'll start slowly. We're going to move next into our career awardee panel discussion. We have 4 awardees with us today from different areas. I have several questions that I'm going to ask and let you answer, and then we'll open it up for questions, because I know everybody always has great questions for our awardees. So the first question is actually a 5-part question, so hopefully you remember. If you don't, I'll remind you. Give us your name, your department, when you were awarded, how many times you applied, and what directorate awarded you. Okay.
My name is Emily Duval. I'm from the Department of Biological Science. I was awarded my grant in July 2015 on my 3rd try. Is that all the parts? And it's in bio, so IOS, Integrative Organismal Systems, in the field of animal behavior.
So my name is Christian Bleholder, chemistry and biochemistry department. I got my NSF career in 2017 on my 1st try in the chemistry. So directorate CS chemical measurement and instrumentation, directorate of chemistry.
Ken Hansen, chemistry and biochemistry. I got mine last January. It was through the DMR EPM, which is the materials, energetic and photonic materials.
My name is Yanni from Chemical and Biomedical Engineering. I got it in the year 2017 as my 3rd try, and it's in the Directorate of Engineering, and CBET is, I forgot the full name, but it's on the CBET, and after the CBET is in the cellular and the biochemical engineering program.
Okay, so we have folks who got it 3rd try, 1st try. So you can see it doesn't follow any certain rule. We used to say, yeah, it probably won't have till your 3rd try, and then we started getting a few people on the 1st try. So you just don't know. So our next question is, how has being awarded a career grant benefited you as a faculty member?
First?
Yep.
So immensely, right? So having funding makes all the difference, right? And so part of that is the 5-year timeline is a lot more psychologically comfortable than the normal 3-year cycle in my main area of NSF. And so that's allowed me to dig in more deeply than average than in a 3-year grant. So I'm currently in the 4th year of the project, and there's still a lot of work left to be done, and I'm delighted with that. So that was great. I hoped, as we all do, to get this before tenure, and I didn't. So I put in 2 applications, and the 3rd was submitted when I went up for tenure. So I received my tenure decision before I was awarded this grant. And so it was a nail biter, and it didn't help me out on that front. It was a nice validation that the university had made a good decision. But I've also been told that it might not help me when I go up for full, even though it didn't help me when I was going up for associate. So whatever, it was great for the research. It didn't necessarily help me on the promotion track.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it didn't matter.
But the research is really greater.
Right, that's what, yeah, I think for funding, of course, it's money. That's important. And I also now realize the 5-year time frame is pretty nice, because most NSF will give you only 3, and then so once you have it, you have to get the work done. The publication takes maybe half a year, so it's almost half 3-year grant. And so with the career, it's 5 years. That's pretty nice. In terms of I think it's very well received, both in the department as well as in the community. So there are not that many in my community that have NSF careers. And so some of the other younger assistant professors, they sort of know that I have one. So that's I think, an advantage of the NSF career. Yeah, and I think it was important for my tenure decision. So that's.
So aside from the research, FSU gives you a $5,000 raise if you get the career. So heads up if you didn't know that. As far as I know, that still exists.
Still there.
That's not a trivial. What's that, Jim?
It does.
Okay. That's not trivial over an entire career. You get the raise now before you get tenure, then you get the 10% raise on top of that. That's, just saying, it's worth keeping track of.
I think it's 12%.
Is it?
12%.
All right. I haven't gotten it yet, so. But yeah, that's nice. Along with what Christian said, the prestige of this award. Like when you break down a per year dollar amount, it's not as good as a standard NSF. Like you can fund one graduate student. But when I give talks other places, every time I'm introduced, it's Ken Hansen has an NSF Career Award. And they don't care if I have a standard award. For some reason, NSF Career means a lot more. So there is prestige in it. And it's, yeah, people pay attention if you get it.
You can get your picture up on the website, right? And a whole news article about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they pretty say about I want to say it's a 5-year grant. It's very actually. I think it's better to get the last year. I got last year. It does help me my tenure and promotion. I have some other smaller grants, but not as prestigious as this one. And then you're fine for your associate professor year, and then you have 5 years grant there. You can continue your research. And also, I think in my year, I think they only have 2 years. They give you the 500K, but later they back to the 400K. Somehow the more money. I just in the window I get the higher amount. Yeah, I guess it's prestigious, and you feel proud of yourself, and also give you the foundation to continue.
So this is my last question, so you all be thinking about what questions you're going to ask. And I have one backup in case nobody does. What is one piece of advice you would give to a faculty member who is submitting either for the first time or follow-up times, if you had that experience?
So I'm an expert on the follow-up times. And as you probably heard, the best piece of advice you can get for that is to talk to your program director. And that made all the difference in my application, and I'm very sure of it. So I had applied with one idea in mind, and I improved it in the second year and got generally positive feedback from the reviews, but no grant. And some criticisms of it, but I had to decide whether to change completely to another idea that I had going on or double down on my first idea. And so I called the program director and explicitly asked that. Like, I'm trying to decide whether I dig in or not. And he said, oh, I remember that grant. And literally pulled up his notes from the panel discussion on the grant, read through them without reading them to me, and was like, oh, okay, there was one reviewer who really was just on fire for this grant. They thought it was amazing, and the other people in the room said, did she say that, or did you infer that that's an exciting application of this thing? And the guy had to say, like, oh, actually, I guess she didn't actually say those words. And I knew exactly what they were talking about, and so I said those words and doubled down on it, and it worked. And so I had no idea that that conversation would be quite that productive. Maybe they aren't all, but that was really useful, kind of a little nudge in a direction without actually telling me what to do, and I greatly appreciate it. And so that's just from picking up the phone and calling the program director.
coordinate their artism review, but this is you, like,
Yeah, so that, it was the background context to how these panels work, and I think you guys have talked about that a little bit. I've since sat on panels and been on the panel reviewing career grants too, so there are 3 people in charge of debating the grant, a lead who really does direct kind of how the conversation goes, 2 other people who've read it in depth, and then other people can kick in comments as it goes. And so everybody's sort of eavesdropping on this 3-person conversation. So the 3-person conversation went to a point, got some feedback from everybody else in the room, and the lead has to summarize the conversation, but they don't say everything that happened in the room. The program director is sitting in on the whole thing and taking notes on every grant and how the discussion goes to help decide where to rank those grants later on. So that's where I had the written summary, but then he had additional information that wasn't in that summary that he gave me afterwards.
So I know for me, I have not talked to the program manager before submitting. And so for me that didn't help. But so what I did talk to is my postdoc advisor and asked him general ideas about grants, and I think the advice that he gave me that was very helpful for me is know what you're good at, know your strength, and build on the strength, but don't extend exactly what you've done before. So there has to be, what he told me, make a significant step away from what you've done before the postdoc, but still build on your foundation of what sets you apart from the other competitors that also submit grants at the same time.
So my biggest issue is finding the right home. And so I'm a bit of a mutt. I'm in the chemistry department, but I'm also material science related and engineering related, right? So you can submit to CBET, DMR, or chemistry. And in each of those, there's 2 or so subcategories that I could see reading the description which one I fall under. And so for me, rather than talking to one program officer, I literally went to visit the NSF and I talked to like 5 of them. And I said, here's what I have, gave them a 1-page summary, like PowerPoint slide. If you've ever heard about a quad chart, it's like, here's what the problem is, here's how it needs to be addressed, here's how others have addressed it, here's how I'm gonna do that. And I talked to like 5 or 6 different program officers till I found one that was just genuinely excited. And so very rarely will any of them say, this is awesome and it should be in my program. It's gonna be much more cryptic than that. It'll be like, oh, that kind of falls under the umbrella of things we're interested in, or my program has a lean in this direction and this kind of fit. You have to read between the lines on what they tell you. I mean, at the NSF, if you go to the like Department of Defense, typically those guys are gonna be straightforward and say, this is in my program or it's not. But NSF, for whatever reason, it's much more cryptic.
So before we go any further, in case you don't know, the Office of Research under the CRC has a funding agency travel program where you can get $1,000 to go up to Washington and have these discussions. So, and we have a federal relations person up in DC who can help coordinate your visit. So if that's something you want to explore, that option is there. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, to extend on that, I did an NSF visit plus the Air Force plus Department of Energy during that trip, and it was funded through that FAT travel grant.
Yep.
So it's worth it. I mean, if nothing else, they've seen your face and they feel bad for rejecting you. It's probably worth the trip.
okay, my problem is not finding the home, because I know exactly which program I go to. I tried 3 times on the same program, and my problem is finding a good idea. And this idea is just sharpening like along the year, and you can see it's better and better. And actually I did submit the one to the regular proposal panel, which I think I heard some people suggested. It almost got funded, but it's rejected, so I know they like the idea, so I revised those one into a career proposal. That's, I think you can show the improvement of it. I don't have advice if you want to switch program. Usually I don't encourage you to switch program. You have to find the right program at the beginning. And also, I also attended, I have 2, I think I got 2 times of those FAT travel. One time I went to the NSF conference, fall conference. They just gave the general NSF proposal, those kind of training workshop. The other one is just for career, it's the NSF career workshop. For that workshop, they gave you like 6 proposal. It's a real proposal, but you're supposed to shred it after your review. You are reviewing those, and then give the rating, and then they will check you to see which ones. Which is you are reviewing the career proposal, And then you know which, there's two like will be good ones, those two will be there to talk with you about experience. So you're able to, it's not a real reviewer, but you can kind of like mock review.
I think those were helpful. I want to open it up to you because this is really your time. You may have questions as you've heard things so far today, and with 4 folks that have been through this is the perfect time to ask those types of questions. So are there any questions anybody has thought of?
So how important is it to know panel members in NSF or to have served in a panel in NSF to get a career award? Is there a direct relation to that?
So you don't know who's on the panel?
No. I do need to know the person, like the reviewers personally, or do I need to go and meet them? Is that a necessity to get?
So you can't because they're anonymous. So, so the reviewers are always, their names are withheld from you, and they don't even have the option to reveal themselves. I think it does help if you have standing in your field and you know people generally from conferences, and then they happen to be in the room and can say, oh, this guy does amazing research. But you aren't required to meet them because you can't meet them.
Or should I be serving in panels before so that people get to know me?
Yes, if you can. Definitely seeing that, like seeing how panels work seems really helpful. Did you have a comment on that?
You can't serve on the career panel beforehand, but you can be general panels.
But yeah, general panels.
Yeah.
And in bio, it's mixed. So on any one panel, there are career proposals, and then there are other proposals mixed in, and they're all evaluated on the same footing with an extra conversation about the teaching part of the career.
That's actually worth note. Depending on the program you apply to, they do different strategies for reviewing. Some will do ad hoc, send it out to individuals. Some will do a panel. That sounds like it's mixed. I haven't heard that before, because chemistry, as far as I know, doesn't do it that way. But that's why the conversation with the program officers is so important. They will tell you how the process works.
And I think in general it helps that if a reviewer sees your proposal, has seen talks from you, and okay, yeah, now if they read the proposal in the context of having seen your face and knowing you do good work, I think that's very helpful. But you can't, intentionally meet the reviewer in order to get the career.
I just wanted to know about your education plans. What differentiated you from the pack?
I'm happy to keep talking with you.
Okay, I can start. I think educational plan, you have to be distinguish yourself. And if you see other people were talking about, okay, the women and in engineering, usually it's women and minority, the underrepresented groups. You have to treat it as you are going to publish the paper on education, scientific education. You find the hardcore like literature. So I can find the literature in the PNAS about how the disparate, how those women like gender affecting the career path. You have to treat it. You have to have like about 10 to 15 real hard educational literature as your references. And your activities, like you have to have the concrete activities, like specifically what you did do and how many people influence. You cannot talk about the very general. One thing I think it helped me is the MagLab. In the MagLab, there's a center called Integration of Research and Education. The director is Dr. Roxanne Hughes. She actually helped me, asked me to serve on the science girls camp. Science girl camps in the summer for the middle school girls. And last month, he also asked me to attend for the speed mentoring for the high school girls. Those kind of specific things we like to see. Like you cannot just generally talk about. The other things is like a unique background of you. I have industrial background. I work in the industry for a long time. So I have to see, I use my industry background to build the pipeline of the, from the student to the career of the industry. So you just have to have something like signature activity that people remember is yours.
My science outreach was something called Ask a Scientist, which we still do. I started it my second year here, actually. First Friday, if you go down to Railroad Square Park where there's all the food trucks and everything, we set up a tent that has a sign that says Ask a Scientist, and we drink beer and talk to people. If any of you are interested in doing Ask a Scientist, please contact me, because it's an awesome experience. It's fun, it's super easy. Just show up, drink, and talk to people. And so, as far as I know, that was unique, and the thing I had to do was tie that idea into my research and how it relates to my research. So at Ask a Scientist, we write our name, and then underneath we say expertise, and I'm the solar cell guy, because that's what I do, so I could tie it into that topical area. The other thing they care about is how do you assess the success of your event. And so I said things like keep track of the number of people, the number of scientists, volunteers, things like that. I mean, whether that matters, there's no renewal on an NSF career, but it's in my proposal.
So I don't know how important the weight is in terms of the research or the teaching, but I feel like a good teaching statement is not going to, it's like a teaching statement and a faculty application. It's not going to get, a good one is not going to get you the application through, a bad one can kill it. And what I found is important is that, as Ken said, tying the teaching with the research. I think that's something that I found, that I felt was what the reviewers liked, is that there's a symbiosis between the research and the teaching. And that so the teaching comes out of the research, or that, you know, and the teaching goes back into, ties back into the research also. So what I did, for example, I was developing a method, and my teaching was mainly about then teaching the method to the community, allowing them to use it. And that will then also tie back into my research, because I learn what I'm supposed to do better with the method. So that was my approach to the teaching.
And in retrospect, I think I probably overdid it on the teaching side of things. So it was only 2.5 pages out of the total 15. But since this was my third application, I basically made the teaching part a little bit better and more complicated every year. So my teaching component involves, I do research in the Republic of Panama, and so I bring undergraduates from FSU to Panama with me in every year. In alternating years, it's an REU, where they're doing an independent project working alongside my research team, and the 2 students that have done that so far have taken their projects to a national conference and presented posters on their research, which has been really beneficial. And in alternate years, I run a 10-person undergraduate field course, teaching them 2 separate undergraduate courses that are required for their biology degrees anyway. And so they do independent projects, and they also participate in the long-term research of the birds that we work on in Panama. On top of that, those students develop outreach programs for the local primary schools. So it's FSU students, it's benefiting somebody who is a US citizen, but they're also developing activities for K through 6th grade students from Panama, and then enriching their scientific experience and their awareness of the local ecology, which is something that is very important to me, and I know it's not very important to NSF. I was explicitly told by the director that those people are not Americans, so we're funding you not because you're doing good things for Panama, but because the Americans are involved. Fair enough. Everybody's goals are accomplished. And as part of that, I included some very clear assessment strategies and plans to develop, to publish some papers based on the assessed success of a field course in developing critical thinking skills.
So I'm a field scientist, and so actually having this sort of field-based component of your work was a part of the education plan.
And the research. Yeah, it's a really integral part of what I do. I study wild bird behavior.
Okay.
Question? I have a question.
Yeah, I have a specific question. When you go to visit the NSF funding agent, do you need to reach out to all the different program officers in advance, or they actually have an open house or something and then you can just talk to everybody?
So I scheduled everything in advance.
Oh.
I mean, they have like workshops and things like that where there are several of them, but scheduling a visit, I haven't gone to the new NSF building. I guess that's very different. There's higher
I
standards.
want to comment on that. For the people that are pre the new NSF building, your experience will be totally different with the new building. The new building security is very tight. You cannot visit an officer unless they come down and get you from the lobby and escort you upstairs, escort you back downstairs again. Or they can pass you off to another program officer, which means you have to schedule very tightly, make sure they're all on the same day and they're all at non-overlapping times. And I can tell you as a program officer, that's very hard to do. My time as a program officer was committed to lots of activities at NSF. And when people would try to set up an appointment with me, it was not always possible. So I would encourage you, if you do that, plan far in advance, but also don't rely on that. A telephone conversation is just about as good as a face-to-face. I know it's nice to see somebody's face, as one of you mentioned, when they turn you down. Oh, I feel bad. But the same thing happens on a nice telephone conversation. When you've spoken with someone, you get an idea of their personality and they feel like they're a real human being. So I think that don't minimize the importance of a telephone call.
There's a question.
Yeah, so I think it depends all by the research area, but about this letter of the collaboration. So did you get the letter of the collaboration? Is it generally helpful, or is it good to have some, I know it's just about the collaborating, so it's not any kind of recommendation letter, right? Did you get any of these collaboration letters, or what do you think about this?
So I did, as part of another part of my outreach that I forgot, because I added so many things to it, is that we run a live webcam of the behavior of these birds. It's going to be deployed for this year in the next week or so. So you can actually peer into the forests of Panama and see what these birds are doing 24 hours a day between March and the end of May. And that's hosted by Cornell University, which has a bird cams program that has things like that all around the world. And they already have a viewership of about 1 million people who are just fascinated by these webcams. And so having them involved meant that I didn't have to learn how to manage a webcam, and that we were tapping into an existing fan base, basically, of people who are interested in science and animals and birds. And so I had just the form letter, because you can't say anything except for exactly what the template says, but from the people at Cornell saying that they agreed that they would be involved as described in the project, which was that they were hosting the webcam. And I think it shows that you've really thought this through, and that you've made the connections that you would need to do to make this thing happen. And it's also really useful in your broader, or in your teaching plan, to tap into existing resources like that. You don't get extra credit for learning how to run a webcam yourself. It's actually more effective and easier on you if you tap into existing structure.
I don't think it's going to help you necessarily, but not having it and claiming you're relying on someone else, it's going to hurt you. Right, so if you write in there, I'm going to use someone else's webcam, and you don't have that letter, like it's going to work against you, because they don't think that established relationship is real unless there's an actual signed document that says yes.
Right. I think if you have some kind of specific resources that you need, maybe it's going to be better to have some collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're going to do like EPR or something at the Mag Lab, having the person in charge of that instrument write a letter, again, it's standard form. It says, if this titled proposal gets funded, I will do what they say I'm going to do. That's
right.
Yeah, I have 3 letters. I think one from the research side. It is the neuroscientist from College of Medicine. There are 2 from the educational purpose, and one from a national lab, Dr. Hughes, and one from the director of the Challenge Learning Center. I actually think the educational letter is sometimes quite important. They use your educational activities, you really can execute.
Okay.
So if you're working, say, with Liberty County Middle School, you would have that from them if you're going to do outreach to that community.
Yeah, I had a standard NSF where I didn't have that letter for some kind of outreach like that, and it would have been nice to see a collaborative letter from this person. So it's a not so subtle hint. Have that letter.
Okay. I think you had a question.
Yes. What was your biggest mistake in your first or second try if you get your award later?
Well, so I talked about how I had a really good idea that I didn't want to sell all the way, in part because I thought that I wanted to use the grant to collect the additional data to add to my preliminary data to make this really cool statement. And so I held back a little bit. I didn't give all the preliminary data that I had, or I gave the preliminary data, but I didn't sell it as boldly as I could have, because I wanted another 3 years of data to really nail the question. And they wanted me to be more bold in how I was describing the implications of what I was doing from the start. So I didn't brag quite enough in my first 2 applications. If that makes sense.
I have no idea. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't think the proposal number 3 was dramatically better than my first one. It had more preliminary data and it was more polished and maybe I sold it better, but like the reviews from round 1 did not help me in round 2, did not help me in round 3. It's different reviewers every time, and I got in a circumstance where it was a different program officer every time.
But yeah, but when you, I guess in your 3rd try, you would go back to your 2nd one. So what would you improve then?
It's hard to tell because the things that they nitpicked on the 2nd one didn't show up at all in the reviews on the 3rd one. It was very, I don't know, I'm a bit jaded about the process because of that, but you do get better at polishing the message as well as the, the preliminary results matter and things like that.
Yeah, I think for me, I think my ideas is better, more coherent compared to the first one and the second one. And first one is I think is bad. Myself, I think is bad because I just look at try. And the second one is I think about put my best idea together. But it says they are more like 2 separate proposals, so not coherent enough. And for the third one, I just take one idea from second ones and use that idea to make the 3 aims, which are coherent. They have to see those 3 aims how to interconnect each other. They're independent, but also they are, interconnected with your overall goals.
One thing that I didn't realize you could do until I had sat on a panel was including sections on response to previous reviews. So the reviewers sometimes change, or almost always, I think, are different, and yet you can raise points that show that you've thought these things through by having, hopefully, a not very whiny paragraph explaining the previous reviewers commented on this, this, and this, and I've addressed those concerns by this, this, and this. And so just very briefly summarizing that you've done the due diligence to address that information.
Adds to that something. The panelists don't always know whether this is your first, second, or third try, but this is a subtle way of sneaking it in.
Yes.
So they realize this is my last chance.
Right. Yes, definitely. I feel like
more favorable to be exposed if they know this is your last try.
But panelists do have access to the jacket.
They do not.
No.
In biology, you do. Yeah.
No, they don't have access to eJacket, the database.
Yeah, but there's the last panel, the panels in the paper jacket that had previous.
We never could. In fact, we're not allowed to.
I
As a
didn't
program
really
officer,
bio.
we're not allowed to answer questions that the panelists had about prior submissions by the PI.
Cultural differences, biologists are more freewheeling.
I think that's changed though. So I was maybe 3 years ago, I was on a panel that included some career grants and we had no prior information on the grant either. And so, but there definitely was a bit more sympathy for people who said, I've addressed these 2 previous rounds of comments.
I always put my responses to the reviewers in the first paragraph of a proposal, basically a paragraph.
But to avoid being coming across as defensive, as you
Right.
said, we had a proposal with the third tribe that lost it on that. She had, not only that, but she violated the font size rules because she was trying to squeeze in answers to every question that had been raised by any prior reviewer, and it just came across as too defensive, and
Yeah.
panelists reacted negatively.
If you sound like you're mad at the people who are reading the grant, but none of them had anything to do with it previously, then you just seem like a jerk.
Well, for this one, because I write both NSF proposals and NIH proposals, I know NIH you can see the the one-page introduction to address the comments. NSF do not really do that, and I think I learned from my colleagues, like if your NSF proposal is rejected, you can ignore, it's okay to ignore the review's comments because it will be different, but your goal is like you have some weakness people can point to, you just focus on improve your proposal to be a very attractive proposal. The review is different. Sometimes they said this year you almost got it, but next year it's getting worse. So you cannot just simply see when they ask some points, it doesn't mean those specific points, it just means they think your proposal has has weakness. Then they find out some specific to justify that. Then you have, from that point of view, it's like you just, revise it to be a strong proposal.
I'm sorry, I really didn't know that we can put this reviewers kind of comment in the introduction, but do you have a...
Be very judicious about that. It could backfire on you.
Right.
Points out border blemish, maybe, if there's this, identifies weaknesses, but I think it's a defensive way of dealing with the fact that you're getting a different set of reviewers who may criticize the very changes that you made from the previous review. That happens.
So is it good? Depends,
But if the previous reviewer made a comment that you agreed was a weakness of your proposal, and you feel wholeheartedly that it was a great idea, and you're going to incorporate it in the new proposal, then that comes across positive, right? You could say, as suggested by a previous reviewer of the proposal, we have decided to go an extra mile here. We're going to add this extra experiment that we weren't planning on doing, or in our outreach program, we're going to use this assessment technique. Sort of like giving credit, okay? In the sense that when you give a citation, you give credit for things.
Yeah.
That comes across as positive, but you don't want to bring out negatives and just continue proposing the same thing you proposed before, and now just try to give us a defensive argument for why you're doing it. I think that would be negative.
You could be as bold as to make a gratuitous statement to the effect that you believe the proposal has been significantly improved by the peer review process.
Oh, yeah, put an acknowledgement. Why not? Acknowledge the review.
I've seen it, but yeah.
I've seen a few of those.
For me, I rolled that section into, you also, if you've gotten a previous NSF grant, you have to include a statement of your results from prior funding.
Right.
And that can be about a page out of your total grant. So you have to, my career was a carry-on from the previous work. It's my research program, right? So it's related. And so I've tried to strategically use those results from prior research to make people interested in what I was proposing to do now. So it's not just a bunch of unrelated stuff.
Right.
And then added on the response to previous reviews after that. So it's sort of the build-up of the history of the project and how this particular idea has changed over time.
So if I were to compare a career proposal with any other NSF proposal, right? So NSF proposal in general, like the research novelty is the most important thing, as I understand. So you need to convince the reviewers that the research that we are going to do is very extensive and very novel. I think that decides whether it's going to be funded or not. Now, career, as I understand, has a strong educational component as well, besides research. So should the research part be as extensive, as in-depth, or should it be slightly different as compared to some other regular NSF proposal?
I think his career research is same as the other regular proposal. It's just like they have more educational components compared to regular proposal, and so that's why you have less space to talk about your research. And also, I think some people would say, and in the past they will see talk about your 3 directions career, But then later I figured out, even its direction, you still need to provide specifics. You cannot talk about the general thing. I just revised for my one. I revised my regular proposal into the career proposal. So research is very important.
And what I saw on the panels was that the careers were judged by exactly the same scientific criteria plus the teaching component. So you had to get just as much information and make it just as great, if not better, in less space, and then ice the cake with the teaching component. And I did see proposals that had exciting, amazing teaching and not as good research, and they didn't even get close to funding. So the research really is key.
And the other way around.
The other way, yeah.
Very, very strong scientifically written proposals, but the education part was just flat.
And in the panels I saw, people had taken the teaching thing quite to heart. So I didn't see one get dinged for that, but they were all quite good on that. So
I've seen cases where the conclusion of the panel was this proposal should have been submitted as a regular grant. But it's mainly about the research.
I want to ask ask a question? So, in preparing your proposals, how many of you relied on your colleagues and peers to review your proposal, vet it, and how early in the process did you get the draft proposals to them? And maybe another question is, was it helpful?
Yes. Okay, maybe I start. I do ask every person possible in my relationship to review the proposal, and I ask the Office of Development, OPD, to review it. I ask my husband, well, he's faculty, unfortunately, so review it. I ask the other people, colleagues in other university, they have career already in the field. They said, how about you help with review? I think it's because they can tell the weakness, you did not realize it. It's up to you to change it now. If you not agree, you don't have to change it. And also your chair, your chair usually has good idea of about how the career proposal look like, especially your department has career before.
So I got, I didn't really spend too much time writing it. So it was, I started writing it a month before. I was very late. And so, but my goal was really to get the feedback. I did not expect to get it. And so I was done with my first drafts, like when I said, okay, kind of okay with this, where all the figures in, like 4 days before the deadline. And yeah, so I didn't feel comfortable asking somebody to review it for me. Because, it is unfair asking somebody to review a proposal a few days before the deadline. I somehow just said the right words there,
So I'm with you in that I tend to do things towards the last minute, and so on top of that, in my first submission, I was 9 months pregnant, and the deadline was a few days after my due date, but my son was early. And so I went into labor a few days before I was supposed to be turning in the grant, and of course it wasn't completely done. So while I was in labor, I emailed the program director and asked if I could maybe get an extension, and they said, sure, you can have an extra 2 weeks. And it turns out that's actually, you really need more if you have a newborn than 2 weeks, but that's okay. So if you happen to be pregnant, plan a little further ahead. But I didn't, on that draft, send it to colleagues. As I was revising it for the next round, I have a colleague who's writing feedback I greatly appreciate, who's not exactly in my field, and so she read it for clarity and provided some feedback, and I honestly don't remember on the third round if I got feedback or not.
I'm an early person. I already have the proposal ready 2 months before it's ready. But for the ones which is the winning ones, I clearly know because it's rejected by the regular panel in May. I submitted in October, but I waited for a long time. They finally rejected the proposal. Then I said, okay, they advised me to revise it into a career proposal. So that's from May. I spent the month of June to revise it and July deadlines.
Do you happen to know how busy the programs you're applying for? And how crowded in terms of number of proposals they receive, or does it make any difference?
I know my directorate has a 5% funding rate right now. So,
You can ask program
for
officer.
everything.
Wow.
Yeah.
You can talk with the program officer after you got your comments, and they tell me, at least they tell me how many proposals reviewed and how much they funded. For my ones, I think the one time is 48. They found I'm ranking at what? I forgot, it's 6 or 5, but it's very close, but not ranked. They can tell you this, the program officer.
So about this reviewing stuff, so I heard from one university they are trying to collect all these pre-proposals and sending to external reviewers, and they're actually kind of paying them. The university officially are paying them to review it, and they get some kind of good feedback, I guess, because it's paid. But do you think, is it really going to be a helpful process in terms of this, getting some reviews from external?
Oh, more than one thing.
Yeah.
that person is not allowed to review your proposal, but NSF has a conflict of interest. So be careful, if there's somebody you want to be able to review your proposal, not to pay them to pre-review it.
Right, but I thought it was interesting, it's not, yeah.
So
Well-
maybe one thing, what I thought was really helping me a lot was the database that you have. And so I looked at,
Funded?
found especially 3 different prior proposals, like from the 2-3 years before they were funded, that's sort of related to what I do. And I learned from them how they set up the, like how they set up, like how they structure the grant. And that was extremely helpful, I think.
So let me get on the soapbox. Your departments, by and large, have very successful principal investigators. For many of you, your departments have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in setting you up. They're investing time in ensuring that you're succeeding. They have a vested interest in seeing you succeed, and you ought to tap into that expertise. But the only way to use it effectively is to get your proposals done a little bit earlier than some of you last-minute people, so that you can give them time to do a thorough and careful job of reviewing it. And that feedback is really, really very good, because there are certain things that you just don't see, because you know the subject matter so much, you're seeing between the lines, but your reviewers don't see between the lines. So I make a plea, and I think when you ask a colleague to review your proposal, it tweaks their ego a little bit. They respect your judgment, and it's a recognition that you're a strong researcher and a capable proposal writer.
I don't think you should wait until the proposal's written to do that.
No, that's true. You
Because
can pitch ideas, yeah.
As a person who's been asked to do this kind of thing, it's a lot easier to review a one-page pre-proposal, white paper for proposal, and give you some good feedback that help you continue with the writing of the proposal with more likelihood of success, than it is to be presented with a 15 pages of text, and it's already there, and now you're saying, oh, well, you need to add something, you gotta take something out, or you need to totally redirect this proposal. It's too late. You will hold back on making some of the best comments because you would realize that there's no time to implement them, or that the PI is already too committed to what they've done. So I would recommend that you contact people very early in the process, whether they be program officers, we talked about that, but also colleagues, and give them the one-page abstract to look at first. And then you can say, well, would you be willing to help me with the detailed editing later? But they may have some really constructive comments early that would take you days or weeks to implement.
Sorry, that does remind me that for at least one of those drafts, I did have my postdoc read it as well, and my current grad students. And so this whole thing is about integrating teaching and research, right? So one of the ways you can do that is by contributing to training of other people to write these grants. And so it's a humbling thing to give your imperfect grant to somebody and show them how their very own advisor is still struggling with how to write this paragraph. And yet from the students and postdocs perspective, that's really useful to see how these ideas come together. And so so I did sort of lay myself bare to my lab during this process too, and try to make it, even if I was not going to get funded, to make it productive for them to see how a grant comes together, because they don't really see that until they themselves are faculty often.
Well, just to add, so I did that too. So I gave these, when I was finished with my first round, I gave it to the postdoc in my lab. And she gave me really good feedback on it. But I didn't feel comfortable giving it to a person that, is my peer, because that would be a little bit disrespectful. But yeah, that was helpful. So even the postdoc, that's also helpful.
Extending on all this, one thing I found really useful is sharing the reviews with my senior colleagues, because they have a good idea of what is actually being said. I mean, there's context between the lines that I'm not experienced with, and my senior colleagues were like, there's a general ambiance of this being a problem, and it's something I wouldn't have recognized because I don't have that experience.
So that brings up, so you do get denied and you get these reviews. What is your first step? What do you do? What do you do when you look at these? What would you advise somebody to do with that information?
Don't take it personally. I mean, there's gonna be stupid comments in there, there's gonna be stuff that's scientifically incorrect, and you just brush it off because you have another cycle, and there's nothing you can do to convince the program officer to give you money after the fact. You can't fight them on this, just accept that that's what's on the page, and just take as much information from it as you can. And again, senior colleagues can help you do that in an effective way.
My first thing is to call the program officer and to ask about like what the proposal, where ranking and how is it, and also I want to say is like the first several pages is very important. If the people cannot get good impression on the first several pages, they probably make their mind very after those. So you have to keep that. A lot of time they see those, they make the mind, then they figure out what's the reason for that.
I mean, I think it's like, well, other grants got rejected, so I do have some experience in that too. And so I think what I try to do is then, for a week, not read the reviews, but then after a week, just, like if you have a paper rejection, read it through, objectively see, what is objectively right, what is objectively wrong, or what is your mistake and what can you do. Talk to colleagues, and then at some point talk to the program officer and get their feedback, discuss that with them.
And the way I read NSF reviews is first look at the category that you've been put into by each of those reviewers. So you probably discussed you're excellent, you're very good, you were good, which is bad, or, or something below that. And so you have a set of reviews, and some of them thought you were amazing, and some of them didn't. And so first, I just look at the categories to know how close I got to funding or not. If you have a lot of excellence and somebody who thought you were poor, this was an outlier that pulled you way down. And then I focus more on the person who said that it was poor and why they got the impression that they got. And then if everybody was sort of, this is very good, but not exciting enough, so I read all the texts and try to figure out which version of not quite funded I was and correct appropriately. So either there was a fatal flaw that one person noticed and then convinced everybody else that it was terrible, or nobody was quite excited enough and I need to change the overall thing. But the categories do matter, and the people have to justify what category they've put you in. And so categories first. If that's demoralizing enough, go out for coffee and make yourself feel better, and then read everything and try to figure out what sort of changes have to be made.
Yeah, I actually want to share one of the ones I received. The most painful comments I get, it is 2E and 1G, and then it's killed because their three person has to be reach the consensus like their proposal is good. If there's somebody not agree with the other two review, it's still killed. So the good proposal, they think it should be everybody read it, they think it's good.
So in that period of time when you first receive it and you're emotional, and that is not the time to call the program officer.
We don't need that.
Unless
So-
you never want to get started.
Yeah.
I mean, if your research is such that you fit in multiple programs in NSF, so is it a good idea to switch programs between one CRI and another?
I would talk to them before you do that and see what the directors think,
Sometimes they'll switch it for you.
right?
So you'll submit to one program and they'll read through it initially and switch it to it automatically.
They need your permission to do that.
Yeah.
So they'll give you a phone call if they do that. But I frequently was on the other side of that process. It seemed obviously the wrong program. Call the PI and say, do you mind if we move it? And we did. But it's much better, as one of you said earlier, is to get it in the right program the first time by calling program officers and get a feeling for the fit.
I mean, one easy way to do that is submit a standard NSF before the career, right? So like your second, you have 3 tries, right? So that's probably year 3, 4, and 5 of your assistant professorship. Year 2, submit a standard one to that program and see what the feedback is, because you'll get that feedback typically before the next career cycle. So you can see if you fit in that context.
So what I did was I looked up like who in my field that read my papers, that are the reviewers, who in my field is funded by which program in the NSF. And I chose, and there was one, it's the chemical measurement and imaging program of chemistry, and that's where my community is. So I want to submit to that because the reviewers will be from my community. That's how I chose the program.
I actually took that advice of submitting a regular grant first, or early in my, in the process, and then test the waters, and it got funded. And then that was my big career idea, and so it was great, and yet it was earlier than I was planning, and that wasn't part of the master plan. And so then I think it's much harder to get a grant if you have an overlapping concurrent grant as well, and so that probably affected.
That is an awesome problem to have.
It was
So it's not
kind of
It runs out before your tenure decision.
right, and that was the first thing my chair said, like, great, now you need another one. It's gonna run out before your tenure. So.
That is a problem in general. If you're too successful.
It's not
I
what
remember reviewing, managing the review of a bunch of these guys who were, actually the most extreme case, there was a sort of category. It was people who had done postdocs, or in some cases had a research non-tenure track position, like a research associate, like say working at the Mag Lab here or something. And they had worked on grants for 10 years, you know, other people's grants, other PIs, or maybe even been a co-PI. And then they finally got moved into a tenure track and then applied for one of these career awards. That's a hard one because they really have a career already. They've got publication lists a yard long, and their career is well established. And now what do you do? And your case is a little, not quite as far, but on that continuum there, it gets harder and harder. I just gave you that extreme case. But people do succeed sometimes. You just have to think of an additional, either following the same path, the next step, or a new branch somehow.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think this has been very helpful.